Okay, hello everyone. If you're just joining us, we are about to begin tonight's talk. I am not 75, even though the screen says that. But my name is Scott Smallwood. I'm a professor of music and media arts at the University of Alberta and the director of the Sound Studies Institute. And we're really happy to be welcoming Helen T. Abbot tonight to speak to us about some of Anaïs Nin's work. We are coming to you from Amesquatchie, Waskahegan, which is in Treaty 6. This is known by the colonial name Edmonton, Alberta. And we are part of a diverse group of people who have lived here over generations, traditionally by the Cree and Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Inuit, and many others. Sound and music has been heard and created and celebrated here for thousands of years by many diverse First Nations and cultures. And tonight we're humbly adding our sounds to this history with respect and solidarity. If you're here for the first time, SSI, or the Sound Studies Institute, is a research institute at the University of Alberta situated in the Faculty of Arts. We celebrate and support research into sound from all angles, including performative and artistic understandings of sound, i.e. music, but also other human and even non-human understandings of the role of sound in our world. So we're really happy to be presenting on work from literature this evening. Helen T. Abbot is from the Center for the Study of Theory at Western University, and her talk explores the role of sound and music in A Spy in the House of Love and the Seduction of the Minotaur by Anaïs Nin. These novellas, which are two of the 5 interrelated novellas that together comprise Cities of the Interior from 1954. And they're fulgent with musical metaphors, sonic and musical representations, and examples of soundful writing. The musicality, if you will, of each novella is entangled with both female protagonists, Sabina and Lillian, journeys towards self-knowing, specifically in relation to love, marriage, desire, and sex. Abbot explores the musicality and soundful nature of both novellas through a non-monogamous and kink-positive approach to not only contribute to undoing noted misogynistic mononormative engagement, through which some of her works have been misunderstood, but also to take seriously the multiple forms of desire that are present and curiously have been overlooked within cities. Throughout, Abbot will highlight how the themes of kink, love, sex, and depictions of race and cultural borrowing are entangled with the sonic on Sabina's and Lillian's trajectories. So I'm really excited to hear this talk. Abbot is a sonic intimacies scholar, multidisciplinary artist, 4th-year doctoral candidate at Western University's Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism, and a lecturer in the anthropology program at the University of Ottawa. She received her BA in music from Tufts University and MA in ethnomusicology from the University of Toronto. Her research interests lie at the intersection of music studies, sound studies, gender studies, and sex studies. Abbott's work looks at the nature of intimacies in a variety of forms and how these intimacies are mediated by sonic phenomena. More specifically, her doctoral project is an exploration of the mechanisms and consequences of writer Anaïs Nin's self-proclaimed feminine musical writing style in her novel Cities of the Interior, which you're about to hear this evening. Abbot is interested in how Nin mobilized this style of writing to explore certain complexities of womanhood in relation to love, desire, and self-knowing. In addition to her thesis, Abbot is a working violist and publishes creative writing. And thank you for your patience as I read through that, but I thought it was important because there's a lot of good stuff in there, and I think we're all going to be excited to hear what she has to say. So I'll turn it over to Helen. Thank you for joining us this evening.
I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see the slideshow? Good. Okay, so thank you
Great.
so much for your introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. I love the Sound Studies Institute, and I'm really excited to just share a little bit about what I've been thinking about with regards to these two novellas. So before I get into it, I'm going to just give a little bit of a preamble about how I came to this project. Like Scott was saying, I come from a music and sound studies background. And when I started my PhD at the Theory Center at Western a few years ago, I was still trying to figure out my dissertation project and had a few case studies I was working through before deciding, all of which dealt with relationships between sexual expressions, sound, and gender. And I was reading through sound studies literature during this process, but specifically Douglas Kahn's Noise, Water, Meat. And I came across Anaïs Nin's name in a section about Artaud, in which Kahn was discussing and citing a review by Nin of one of Artaud's performances / lectures. So I read the review and instantly became interested in her writing and dug into her further, and discovered her fiction dealt largely with themes of desire, womanhood, and love. Upon further investigation, I discovered she had a self-proclaimed musical style of writing that she also described as symphonic writing, music of the womb, and vaginal song, among others. And that's what really drew me into her work. But if we don't essentialize the category of music, this approach to writing, or this idea of writing musically, was at first pretty interesting and puzzling to me. I think, by itself, musical writing doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? Which musics, what music, for what purpose, etc. And so that's what really, really drew me in. And I don't have an answer about what musical writing, means exactly today. But what I will be looking at is one consequence I see of her soundful writing style in at least these two novellas, which is acoustemology. So in trying to think more about this idea of writing musically, which shouldn't be confused with automatic writing, although there are synergies, I came across her 1954 novel, Cities of the Interior, which consists of 5 interrelated novels, or novellas, that can be read in any order, even though there is a suggested order of reading. Aesthetically, it is psychedelic, surrealist, and impressionistic, and it centers on 3 women and their respective paths to know themselves and live a full life in accordance with their emergent natures and identities. One could think of these novellas as empathetic and complex depictions of 3 women's processes of becoming in relation to politics of love, monogamy, womanhood, and codified femininity, and sex, which at times takes on forms of sexual deviance and transgressions, although it's not always like that. When I first read Cities, I was struck by the unusual amount of musical metaphors and soundful writing in general that permeated the novellas, at times to a point of real excess that started to obscure or complicate meaning in a way I found really interesting, and as something that warranted a real deep, detailed engagement that I felt like and still feel like is generally not done with her and her works. Unfortunately, much of the scholarship about Nin, and this is noted by other Nin scholars, is often riddled with pathologizing and misogynistic tones that, in their patriarchally overdetermined analyses, often do anything but encourage a deep engagement with her works on their own terms, divorced from stigma around the figure of Nin herself. So if you didn't know already, Nin is often considered a woman fraught with controversy. And I'm going to go over that a little bit right now, but I don't want to spend too much time on this part in efforts to focus more on taking her writing seriously and sharing with you what I've been thinking with regards to the 2 novellas. So Anaïs Nin was born in 1903 in France to Cuban parents. Her father was a musician, Joaquin Nin, and her mother, Rosa Coulmel, was a singer. And she spent a lot of time in Cuba and Spain in her youth, and a lot of time in France in her young adult life with her husband, Hugo. and later they were relocated to the States because of the war in 1940. In general, she traveled a lot throughout her life and often referred to herself as a borderless woman. But eventually she settled in the States, mainly for the latter half of her life. And she became known for her voracious sexual appetite as she, began to enter into the public eye. That really began in her late 20s with Henry Miller, and she was also known for being a bigamous woman. She began writing her famous diaries when she was 11 and published them in the latter half of her life. She also wrote fiction, erotica, poetry, and nonfiction. A lot of people know her for her diaries and erotica. Her fiction, in her own words, dwells largely on the pursuit of the hidden self. This pursuit centers primarily around her female characters and their psychological and emotional landscapes. She felt that women's experience was as yet inarticulate in established psychoanalytic discourse and in literature in general, and that few writers, among them D.H. Lawrence, who she really loved, had adequately attempted this task. Over time, she developed her own musical style of writing, which came to fruition upon writing Cities of the Interior. Her reliance on a sonic style, according to her, helped her to directly penetrate the unconscious and inner dimensions of her characters and readers. For instance, she frequently turns to forms of improvisation, like in jazz, or in certain forms of jazz, or the impressionistic impulse of Debussy to describe the inarticulate nature of what she calls the inner life, with its intimate relationships with social and public and conscious selves. Musical metaphors and examples of soundful writing were supposed to help her express the inarticulate and describe what she saw as the essences behind the superficiality of material or external life. While her work was admired by many writers of her time and still is, the subject matter of her works and the frankness with which she wrote about topics such as sexually active women, taboos, or unconventional sexual relations, including incest, such as her own supposed sexual relationship with her father, which we won't get into today, and abortion, made her a figure of controversy, effectively damaging her reputation. The sexism involved in her reception and legacy has been noted, and I would argue her legacy has not fully recovered from the slander she received, and others note this as well, as is partially evidenced by the gap in scholarship in general about her, specifically in light of revisiting female modernist writers who have systematically been ignored, and she was really a really active part of certain literary modernisms and artistic movements. My kink-positive and non-monogamous approach to her works is deliberately in line with recent moves to combat misogynistic and victimizing impulses with which her works, frankly, are still often read through, in which feminine sexuality is rigidly reduced to archetypes, thereby preventing readers from more deeply engaging with the complexities her female characters are trying to live and work through, even if such archetypes are present. In other words, such readings, often from a mononormative and often heteronormative lens as well, can chalk Nin's women's problems up to discourse in some way, such as, women merely with daddy issues or just femme fatales, etc. So I want to frame this talk by really taking seriously what she has written in these novellas for what's there in this more ground up way. And not merely according to discourse in like some over-determined fashion. This, in my mind, further takes Nin seriously as a writer, which is something she felt like a lot of people did not do, likely often because they were overly concerned about who she was sleeping with, and let attendant judgments about her sex life inform engagement with her works, which just reminds me of how, similar figures like Simone de Beauvoir, express similar frustrations with at public talks, having people ask them about their personal lives versus, listening to other things they were trying to say. So in what follows, I'll be looking at how the protagonists in each novella, Sabina in A Spy in the House of Love, and Lillian in Seduction of the Minotaur, navigate their sexualities and experiences of womanhood through acoustemological logics. And by paying close attention to their methods of navigation and taking seriously what each woman is trying to navigate, their respective sexual desires can surface as legitimate. And before I get into it, for those who are unfamiliar with acoustemology, it's a concept coined by anthropologist Stephen Feld, and it conjoins acoustics and epistemology to theorize sound as a way of knowing and being in the world. And this slide is one of Marcel Duchamp's works, Nude Ascending a Staircase. And Nin really liked this work and often used it to describe Sabina's sort of multiple sides of her person, or multiple selves. So I thought it was apt for the section on A Spy in the House of Love. Spy in the House of Love follows a woman through her experiences with multiple lovers in search of self-understanding and a life lived on her own terms. So through this sort of sex-positive lens, I hope to illuminate how sound and music emerge as endemic to forms of seduction, in which the character of Sabina becomes continually entangled as an active participant. The structure of the novella is largely centered on her experiences with each lover, and her husband, Alan, to whom she returns between lovers. The work oscillates rather seamlessly between imagination and reality, and its narrative structure is organic, in which time is nonlinear, sometimes linear at others, often resulting in like a bleeding together of Sabina's inner and outer life in kind of like a psychedelic fashion. So the novella begins with a short prelude in which Sabina, quote, telephones from a bar to a man called the lie detector. The lie detector follows her crimes or affairs throughout the novella and finally appears as a real person in the end's final confession. Ostensibly, Sabina is an actress who perforce travels to perform. However, we soon find out that she uses her absences as frequent alibis to sleep with other men. After Sabina's confession to the lie detector, Sabina begins to undergo a difficult process of self-realizations that leads to more questions than answers. The narrative does not provide a tidy conclusion about what insights emerge from this process, and we are left wondering how Sabina will proceed. And with this non-monogamous lens, I'm really viewing Sabina as largely struggling with her identity as a non-monogamous woman in becoming, in an environment where that's not apparently for her, not easily accessible, at least not without feelings of shame and confusion. So the rest of my thoughts on the work unpack Sabina's relationships with two of her four lovers, to illuminate how the manner by which these intimacies cohere for Sabina exposes her acoustemological orientation. So the first lover is Philip, and the second lover is Mambo. And in between, she returns home to Alan, her husband, who provides her with the acoustemological material to guide her to Mambo. So during one of her travels, as Sabina lay sunbathing, she heard a song with a depth and potency that seemed to derive from her natural surroundings. Nin depicts the song as, quote, a vital hymn of equal strength to the elements. And as the man makes an appearance in her line of vision, upon spotting Sabina, he ceases singing and hesitates. A moment of silence takes place that proves to be vital for the initiation of their relationship. And quote, later he told her, if you had spoken, then I would have walked away. You had the talent of letting everything else speak for you. It was because you were silent that I came up to you. And so he approached and stood before her in silence, which itself, quote, continued to transmit messages between them. So these two quotes rendered the theme of unspoken intimacy as a form of silence, as essential to not merely communication, but to intuitive decisions one must make during processes of seduction. I view unspoken intimacy here as a kind of sonic expressivity because of the necessity of the non-discursive to the realization of their communication, and because silence, as we know, can be understood as a sonic state along a continuum of audibility. Sabina is uneasy about the nature of potential sexual union with Philip. She is haunted, quote, by the image of catastrophe, by the same obsessional forebodings which she had heard in Ravel's waltz. And while the sex itself was pleasurable overall, Sabina awoke the next morning feeling sexually unsatisfied and angry. Their second encounter proved to be more fruitful, in part because she finally achieved orgasm while having sex with a man. And it's implied this is the first orgasm she experienced during penetrative sex. The resultant satisfaction frees her and confirms her as a spy. Quote, she opened her eyes to contemplate the piercing joy of her liberation. She was free, free as man. So Nin describes this scene as being responsible for Sabina's new habits, or habitus, like those of a spy who swiftly moves and anonymously through places and peoples. And this is sort of the beginning of her like non-monogamous journey. With Philip, music functioned to lure Sabina and spark her interest. Further, moments of expressive silence that are highlighted by Nin function as a way of knowing each other as soon-to-be sexual partners. As anticipation grows, her uneasiness finds expression through a musical example, which portends her fate, her inability to sustainably navigate her desires. Sonic fabrics in this section with Philip expose the presence of acoustemology in Sabina's personhood because sound and music were instrumental to her decision to pursue a relation with Philip. After her experiences with Philip, Sabina returned home to her husband, Helen. Their home is depicted as unchanged and as a refuge of steadiness in contrast to Sabina's other lives. Upon her arrival, Alan surprised her with a gift, some records of Il Joyeuse by Debussy. As Alan and Sabina listen to the record, Sabina notices a visceral sound of contact between human and animal skin. And here she's referring to drums. And while it's not entirely clear what Nin is referring to, because there's not any drumming in the original piece, which is for solo piano, we can assume, and I'm assuming, that the reference to drumming is Sabina's interpretation of the work, and that she carries with her throughout the novella as a form of imagined sound. Her thoughts on the music unfold into, and we'll get into this in a minute, a problematic fantasy of bodies drumming, who are led purely by a rhythmic, sort of carnal formula, in which rhythms guide, even if momentarily, social interaction in a way that renders identities anonymous. She describes the process of listening and internalizing the piece as a process of inhabiting the piece, which provided Sabina with the appropriate acoustemological material to guide her to her second lover, Mambo. And quote, because of this, inhabiting the Il Joyeuse, when she heard drumming as she walked down McDougall Street, she found it natural to stop, to climb down the streets into a cellar room of orange walls. Sabina sits and listens to a group of musicians who are vaguely described as drumming and singing, dancing. We don't know exactly what kind of music they're playing. She notices a male musician, Mambo, who returns her gaze and proceeds to seduce her through his performance, quote, until she felt possessed by his song. Throughout the scene, sexual tension between them increases, but ultimately dissipates when Mambo does not approach her after having finished performing. Instead, he continues to play, leaving Sabina bewildered. Eventually, he does approach the table and acknowledge the mutual attraction, but asserts they cannot be together because he feels she only wants to have sex with him because he is Black. And this is next quote from the novella from Mambo. Because I am African, what do you know of me? I sing and drum and you desire me, but I'm not an entertainer. I'm a mathematician, a composer, a writer. Offended by the suggestion, she accuses him of being cynical and speaking from a place of hurt. he admits that he has indeed been hurt by a white woman who looked like her. This theme permeates their relationship, in which he constantly accuses her of loving a stereotypical and racist image of himself. Despite his reservations, he still desires her and continues their relationship for numerous sexual encounters. With Mambo, I view acoustemology as functioning through complex, racist logics that encourage Sabina to essentialize his Blackness through sonic identification. And the way she sort of identifies him through sound can be thought of as like an answer to an acousmatic question. This racialized sonic identification began upon listening to the piece, from which she fantasized about Black bodies drumming in this very problematically and racist, like primitive and sexual manner. And what is so interesting and thorny and important about Mambo here as a lover is how it one points to the complexities involved in navigating a mutually interracial desire within a racially stratified context. Sound leads her to desire Mambo and governs how she understands and engages with him as a sexual partner. Throughout their relationship, they attempt to grapple with and navigate their racial differences through sex. And the fact that Nin wrote a critique of Sabina's racial gaze, I think resonates strongly with Nin's broader endeavor to, as outlined in her nonfiction book, The Novel of the Future, to focus on methods of grappling with differences between people who may be seemingly too different from yourself to understand. So this, she's talking about like across class lines, gendered lines, national lines, race lines, etc., in order to cultivate a more empathetic consciousness in her readers. She was really interested in creating more empathy in the world, especially with regards to difference. Nin felt very strongly that, especially in the wake of World War II, and here she wasn't alone, wake of World War II, where naturalized differences in methods of classification of peoples yielded horrific events, that it was the writer's responsibility to actively deal with this clearly very persistent and prevalent issue to try to make the world a little bit better through engagement with more like socially aware and conscientious art. Now, whether or not Nin always succeeded at this task is a bit complicated because even when her intentions were good, I think one of her biggest pitfalls, and this is noted at times by other people, is that she often used a centralizing language, whether that's with gender or race or whatever have you, even though oftentimes she was trying to do some good. So sometimes she doesn't always succeed at that, but it's worth noting. And with the Mambo example, I think she really included this to try and sit with the complexities of such a thorny relationship that's entangled with politics of race, and to caution against like Sabina's, racial gaze. So this work is a Picasso depicting a Minotaur and other stuff. And I chose this for a section of the Minotaur because it's one of many works, both artistic and literary, in the 20th century that was revisiting the Minotaur in a way that was trying to humanize it in some way, or depict it not just as this like beast that devours people. And Nin kind of is in line with this move to complicate the figure of the Minotaur as people were revisiting it to sort of make sense of a very troubling present and the potential, for a nihilistic future. So Seduction of the Minotaur is centered on Lillian, a married woman with children searching for a reason and subsequent remedy for her unhappy condition. Lillian travels to Mexico, where she had spent some formative years of her childhood, hoping that the change could help her in efforts of self-transformation and discovery. During her time in Golconda, Mexico, which is loosely supposed to be Mexico City, where she had traveled, and she talks about that in her 5th diary. She plays music, meets people, makes friends, etc. And throughout begins to transform into a new woman. And it's important to note here that this is supposed to be the last novella in Cities. And Nin writes in her essays and other works that Lillian is the only character to kind of really find herself at the end. So she goes through this transformation, and while Sabina went through a transformation as well, she was kind of left with more questions than answers. And so through Lillian's transformation, which culminated in her eventual journey into her labyrinthian cities of the interior, this was catalyzed, the eventual actual meeting of the Minotaur was catalyzed by the sudden death of a friend, Dr. Hernandez. And it should be noted that the labyrinthian nature of her interiority is a direct reference to like a surrealist notion of the unconscious, at the center of which lies the Minotaur as the hidden self. Musical metaphors articulate place, space, and peoples of Golconda in ways that create a transformative effect on its visitors, such as Lillian. In Nin's own words, musicalities of the place can be understood as generating the conditions of emergence for Lillian as a woman in becoming. In particular, I think Lillian pursues self-realization through what I call an auditory gaze, from her positionality as a tourist who's constantly navigating the distance this position holds. Her presence in Golconda as an other, i.e. other tourist, oscillates between perhaps acceptable gestures of cross-cultural alliance and solidarity, and also cultural exploitation that borders on colonialist epistemologies, the latter of which I imagine and highlighted on purpose to caution against such behaviors. Further, this position also accounts more precisely for the position through which Lillian participates in cultural tourism, literally as a big band jazz pianist playing with local musicians to pay for her stay. Most importantly, and what I'll expand on in a minute, is the precise mechanism and logics by which Lillian engages and makes sense of her time there, which is what Nin calls in her diaries the third ear. So the musicalities of the place, which here we can start thinking of as kind of essences of the place, according to Nin's own conception of music and musicality. These essences of the place can only be garnered through a particular kind of auditory engagement through her third ear. And while the third ear is a faculty Nin believes most people can exercise, musicians have a particularly apt capacity to use their third ear to not only make sense of essences in life and in things more generally, but also to gain access to significant pieces of knowledge for purposes of instruction. In Seduction of the Minotaur, Lillian hints at this when she writes, quote, "The plots and themes of our lives, never alchemized into words, exist only in a state of music." And I believe that the necessary epistemological consequence of exercising one's third ear renders it an acoustemological faculty that is fundamental and essential to Lillian's development towards self-knowing. So at the beginning, like on the first page, Nin immediately dives into this very luscious description of Golconda, centered on the color gold, which importantly sets the stage for the rest of the novella and implants significant themes regarding Golconda as like a musical place. So just to read a bit from that. She had landed in the city of Golconda, where the sun painted everything with gold, the lining of her thoughts, the worn valises, the plain beetles, Golconda of the golden age, the golden aster, the golden eagle, the golden goose, the golden fleece, and it goes on like that for a while. With her first swallow of the air, she inhaled a drug of forgetfulness well known to adventurers. And one thing to flag here is that in Golconda, she says literally everything is painted with gold. So after swallowing this golden Golconda air, she slowly begins to undergo physical transformations in which she, quote, "was metamorphosed by the light and caressing heat into a spool of silk." The theme of gold is explicated by Nin in her fifth diary, in which she discusses it in relation to music and truths. Its linkage is first explained through her brother's music, who, like her father, was also a composer. Her brother's music was a motif and artistic guiding force, an ethical guiding force, etc., throughout Nin's life, and was what convinced her that for her, music is the highest art form. Importantly, so Nin draws in this excerpt from her diary, Nin draws attention to one of his pieces for piano and strings because of its lyrical quality that distills essences in a delicate manner that still manages to convey a strong sense of emotion and a feeling of like truth. Importantly, Nin says, quote, "The color gold is always part of it." Later, in reference again to her brother and the color gold, she vaguely articulates a more ontological connection between gold and forms of musical expression, in which she writes, "In gold, there is a strange, quote, faculty for musical sincerity which never reaches a common explicit statement." Further, and most crucially, she believes gold, quote, "appeals to a third ear, an unborn ear, the ears of today, more intricate but always true. He, Joaquin, her brother, has a perfect pitch of the soul." So what's important to note here is that gold has a capacity to appeal to this so-called third unborn ear, meaning even without an overt musical context present, such as composition, performance, etc., I believe Nin is articulating that gold has an innate musical quality and capacity. This also makes sense because she truly believes music as a codified art form, which for her seems to encompass a variety of styles and genres, even though sometimes she does essentialize, is the highest art form because for her, music has an intimate relationship with the unconscious, and therefore contains a multitude of expressibles, precisely because of how she felt like it directly sort of supersedes like faculties of reason and things like that, and precisely does not need words. Well, the music she's referring to. The presence of gold at the beginning of the novella epistemologically articulates Golconda with a musical quality that, if engaged with in the right way, through one's third ear, and this is very closely related to the faculty of intuition for her, which she really held in high esteem. She thought it was super important, can yield important knowledge and guidance. As evidence of its ontologically musical quality, it being Golconda, the rest of the novella is riddled with soundful examples that articulate space and place musically, such as how trees carry chromatic scales and reds and blues manifest through musical trills, and so on, in such a way that suggests the potential for acoustemological engagement with the place is really the only way to sort of make sense of and be in Golconda. Golconda is quite literally described by the people who live there as underscored by, quote, "a continuity of music that is conducive to a slower rhythm," and this is Nin talking now in an essay, "in which people seem to live in greater harmony with nature and with themselves." The category of music in this novella often explicitly exceeds acts of music making in ways that reaches non-humans and underlines the place as a, quote, "continuous rhythm of life that, along with its peoples, exudes a more ardent life." The emanating life force of Golconda, that is its musicalities, is also associated with a foreignness that is directly opposed to, as Nin puts it, northern countries. "The night lay unchanged," so, quote, to show this, "the night lay unchanged, serene, filled with tropical whisperings, as if leaves, birds, and sea breezes possessed musicalities unknown to northern countries." Its musicalities are pitched as the opposite of those of so-called northern countries, and are dynamic, in which selves can freely move and bloom in states of intuitive becoming. And this sort of idea of becoming is essential to Nin's conception of the self, and it's quite similar to sort of like a Deleuzian concept of the self. Herself is always dynamic in movement between sort of a virtual and actual type space. And these selves can move this way because they're precisely not existing within the imposition of sort of like strict rhythmic organization of everyday life. And Nin often speaks of everyday life uncannily, like Lefebvre does in rhythm analysis. Its musicalities are further evidenced by the fact that one of the musicians in the novella quit playing violin because he felt the musicalities of the place were enough to satisfy his artistic nature. As Lillian continues on her journey of transformation, she begins to take on qualities of the lifeways of the people there, which are described often as like rhythms, and which could be understood as some kind of like rhythmic adaptation if we're staying with that type of language. For example, the presence of music, whether literally hearing music being played or through descriptions that imply it's the sort of music of the surroundings or the sort of tenor of the surroundings, make Lillian's skin newly blossom and breathe and literally sort of change. This is important in Lillian's transformation and journey to meet the Minotaur because, as stated by Nin in her essays, Lillian makes a parallel inner and outer journey during her stay at Mexico, and that both are required for the birth of a new Lillian, which is implied at the end of the novella. And again, the main manner by which her outer journey takes place is through this sort of like auditory gaze, which has consequences for implanting important themes and truths into her inner personhood as she simultaneously begins to move inwards towards the Minotaur. Instances of cultural borrowing through her rhythmic adaptation, and again, we can understand Lillian's choice of words here as being a consequence of her own auditory gaze, oscillate between cultural alliance, as is evidenced by the occasional acceptance of her by local peoples, in part because she speaks the language and she spent time there growing up. And sometimes it oscillates between this cultural alliance and also exploitative, very problematic gestures and practices. And the fact that Nin makes a point here in Seduction of the Minotaur to include so many different kinds of examples of these cross-cultural interactions, I think, like the Mambo example from Spy, again gestures to her attempt to try and frankly deal with issues of difference. Conceived difference, constructed difference, etc. However, like with Mambo and the rest of her works, unfortunately, Nin often invoked essentializing language to make these points, even if such points are in of themselves largely ethical, stemming from an anti-racist impulse. So there's always that kind of rub there with her works. The most overt example of Lillian's exploitative and unethical participation in social life in Golconda is when she joins some dance activity that was going on inappropriately and claims, quote, "I'm American, I don't have to conform to their traditions," which was not a well-received gesture. And given that Nin even felt the need to write that, I think further underscores the fact that Lillian is supposed to be very complex and complicated in ways that at times make her destructive precisely because of her lack of reflexivity. And Nin talks about that being Lillian's biggest flaw in her essays and stuff, and how that makes her destructive to those around her, like in that example. This lack of self-awareness is directly tied with the theme of kink and sexual deviance because of her inability to understand fundamental aspects of herself and therefore sustainably fold in these aspects to her social self. So fast forward to meeting the Minotaur. There are a lot of details in this novella that we're not going to get into. The meeting of the Minotaur is a little more than halfway through. It's kind of like the telos of the novella, but because Nin didn't really believe in, those kind of climaxes at the end. It's in the middle, and then it kind of dissipates, ebbs and flows until the novella ends. So one day Lillian arrives back to Golconda from having visited a friend, only to find her friend she was looking for, Dr. Hernandez, had been suddenly killed and shot. So the shock of his death sends Lillian into a spiral and hastens her inner and outer journeys. In the following scene, we learn she is, quote, journeying homeward, both because she's on a plane home and is progressing in her inner labyrinth, at the center of which lays the Minotaur. Her inner journey is signaled with the flooding of memories about her husband and previous loves, leading to a series of self-realizations, the first of which has to do with her husband, Larry. With Larry, she began to realize that she could not communicate with him because she could not communicate with all parts of herself. Again, this lack of reflexivity theme. This is even further underscored by the following scene that depicts the meeting of the Minotaur, here on the slide, who is described as the hidden masked part of herself unknown to her, who had ruled her acts and now who could no longer harm her, i.e., this is the part of herself that seeks the connection of pain and pleasure. Immediately following this passage, she began thinking back to her childhood and moments in her life in general, and these subsequent memories start to unveil the base of this hidden self. The most important one deals with her father spanking her as a child, and the theme of spanking in general in her more adult years fondly comes back, and she thinks about, but it rears its head quite a few times. Lillian explains that this is the only memory of her father that made her feel intimate with him in a way that spurred an early connection between pain and pleasure. Lillian remembers, quote, two distinct emotions, one of humiliation and the other of the pleasure of intimacy. And this pain-pleasure connection supposedly began during this early encounter and implanted itself into Lillian's makeup, or at least that's what Lillian is saying. And I think it's really important not to read the way this may or may not have informed her sexual development as, again, creating, say, just an adult woman with daddy issues, because this would effectively strip her of any sexual agency and complexity. This would be like saying that any kind of contamination of so-called proper sexual development inevitably results in a sexually inviable subject in adulthood, which not only is a reductive way of viewing sexual becomings, in part because it assumes we can even fully know how we become ourselves as irreducibly complex sexual beings, across a broad spectrum through asexuality, but also runs the risk of propagating misogynistic, victimizing narratives that, again, strip Lillian of agency as here now an adult woman. Lillian ruminates a great deal on how lack of knowledge about this part of herself had misguided her in her choice of sexual partners. For instance, with a previous lover, Jay, who had, quote, first appeared to be the first bearer of joy, seeking only pleasure, the living moment only, his talk of violence suited her tumultuous nature. But then he had made love without violence, and then asked her, did you expect more brutality? Lillian realizes now that she mistook Jay's anarchistic nature for the kind of dominant sexual, aggressive sexual energy she required in a sexual partner. Her lack of satisfaction in this particular way was present in her marriage as well, which is evidenced by the fact that she realized, quote, not enough of pain had existed in her marriage to Larry. Lillian continues to mull over memories with Jay in a similar fashion, and in the process realizes that some of her lack of knowledge about this side of herself stem from patriarchal oppression that stripped her of self-confidence. Lillian had, quote on the slide, Lillian had no confidence in herself as a woman. She thought that it was because her father had wanted her to be a boy. She did not see herself as beautiful, and later because it gave her a feeling of strength to take flights from the problems of being a woman. Pretend to be a boy when what she most wanted was to be loved by one. Act the active lover so the lover will understand she wished him to be active with her. She acted the aggressive lover, not because she was the aggressor, but because she wanted to demonstrate ... Curiously, Nin does not finish the sentence, which I think further makes the theme of pain and pleasure not only a significant focus, but a real point of tension in the narrative. I think we can say that the kind of pain she wanted in intimacy would be from a position as a submissive partner who is receiving pain and pleasure from a dominant and likely male sexual partner, thereby articulating or loosely articulating Lillian's hidden self as somewhat submissive and masochistic. And this is one of my favorite photos of Nin. The theme of kink is a through line throughout both of the novellas. In Spy, during the symbolic final confession at the end by Sabina to the lie detector, and we didn't really have time to get into that, it becomes clear that, unlike Lillian, Sabina had failed to recognize aspects of maybe her own hidden self or her own desires, because she felt too much shame. Shame is a big theme in that novella. But basically, this aspect of Sabina was that she wanted to tell Alan, but never had the courage to, that for her, he was like a father to her, and that she wished he could be involved and know of all her affairs from the position of as a protective, like paternal figure, so sort of like overseeing. This complicates and deepens Sabina's personhood, in which she desires a very specific relationship with Alan and therefore a very specific kind of non-monogamy that appears to be a version of a sub-dom relationship. And in this sub-dom dynamic, or we can kind of loosely think of it like that, Alan might be understood as a protector and or daddy figure for her, which are two versions of a dom that often go together and describe a dominant sexual partner who radiates a paternal protective energy towards their submissive, which can permeate their entire life, so not just right in the bedroom. Meaning Sabina did not want to merely be non-monogamous, like she didn't want to just sleep with other people. She wanted to be non-monogamous in this specific hierarchical fashion, at the top of which Alan knowingly stands, or she hopes to Alan knowingly stands as a protective figure. And I say knowingly because it's unclear if Alan knows or doesn't know about her affairs. And they do appear to exist roughly in this way, especially with how Alan speaks to her, calls her his little one, and things like that. And because he is the one who gifted her the Debussy piece, which is what guided her to her next lover, and which she carried with her throughout the novella. The point is that the theme of kink and the difficulties of recognizing, let alone accepting such desires due to likely gendered internalized oppression in the form of shame, confusion, destructive behaviors, whatever, is a significant theme for Nin. And between the two novellas, themes of deviant sexuality appear to be tied to the acoustemological capacities of the female protagonists. With both women, their acoustemologies can be viewed as an early conceptualization of the idea, mobilized by Nin to tell a story of, here, two women trying to manifest and understand their sexual natures and relationships with womanhood. Social navigation and identity management are the movements enabled by their acoustemological orientations as women, and paying attention to sound gives a more detailed picture of how Nin attempted to explicate, at the very least, ways in which some women with stigmatized sexualities try to make do, and on the other hand, achieve self-realization with the attendant possibilities of manifestation, self-love, inner peace, and coherence as subjects. Thank you.
Come on, video. There we go. Hi. Just waiting for my the delay on my camera or something. That was great. Thanks so much for that. I think we have a couple minutes for questions, so I will put it to our Zoom audience of just a few. Anyone have a question? Maybe I'll start with one I was wondering about.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, so I'm not familiar with this work. So forgive me if I'm asking something that might be obvious, but I was wondering a little bit about you did mention genre a little bit, but I'm curious about if there are any specific genres or styles of music that she tends to gravitate towards, and I guess I'm wondering a little bit about how she describes the music that she's hearing when and I'm also curious about to what extent the music that she's hearing comes from environmental sounds. I know you mentioned the thing about trees and chromatic notes, and I was really curious about how she conceived of that, whether that was something along the lines of sort of interpreting the sounds that trees actually make, or is it more of a sort of metaphorical trees with leaves, there's lots of pitches there, there's lots of individual discrete kind of note items. I don't know. I just was curious
Yeah.
about that.
No, there's a lot there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, well, I think one thing with Nin is that she often is purposely quite vague, um, in efforts to not over-explain, which is something she kind of felt like a lot of fiction and fiction did, especially like realist, fiction. So in terms of sort of where the sounds are coming from, I think both, as for this novella, I can say, I think both are true. If you compare this to her diary, where she draws a lot of her experiences from for the material for Seduction of the Minotaur, I think you can say that she was taken by the sort of soundscape there in Mexico, as being not like built up in the places she was going. She kind of had this anti, modernizing lifestyle shtick. And so I imagine her affinities with those kind of natural sounds came from that. Um, and but overall, I think it's more metaphorical and is supposed to really be ambiguous. So that kind of gives a lot of nice room for interpretation for the reader. But I think maybe a theme of synesthesia is probably apt to associate with Nin, although I haven't really done a ton of work on that.
Mm.
But she, I think, also just because she loved sound and music so much, she really could like see it and feel it in everything. And because for her music really represented truths, emotions, the unconscious, and things that we can't say. And whenever she saw something or felt something like that, say in nature, she kind of equated them or put them together. I think that was just kind of her own sonic orientation that bleeds into her writing. Um, and for the first question, I can give you names of people she was interested in who are musicians. Again, her writing about music can be really vague. Like I mentioned, like this Ravel waltz, and I in Spy, and I was like digging around to try to find what she's referring to, and sometimes she does kind of throw general structures like a waltz and a name out there like Ravel, and kind of assume the reader, either maybe assume the reader will have something specific in mind, or maybe leave it open-ended so the reader can kind of implant their own associations there. But like she loved Debussy. She liked, I know, like big band, like jazz.
Okay. I wondered if jazz was part of it, and the fact that she's interested in obviously really lush and colorful impressionistic music makes sense. So thank you.
Yeah, the improvising with jazz. She kind of left her love for classical music a little bit and then went towards jazz because she was really interested in how like soloing and stuff worked. She tried to play music, but she wasn't very successful. So she wished she could do that.
Right, and this was 1954, right? When this was something like that.
Yeah, I mean, they kind
So
of published on 1954 through 1959,
yeah,
separate. Yeah.
so a lot of innovation going on in jazz at that time too. So that's really interesting. Well, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Hi.
Hi.
I didn't actually have any question. I just want to thank you because I'm quite new to this world of acoustemology, and I just came out of my comms reading a lot about theory, and it was fascinating to see how you wove that part of like sound study to literature. So thank you. So I don't have any question. I just want to say like thank you very
Oh,
much.
thank
I'm
you.
learning.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening.
I have well, I want to say thank you too, and actually after this I have some people that I want to recommend these works to. But I have a question. You mentioned dance once, and I wonder if dance comes up more,
Mhm.
and if that's connected to what you're talking about too, basically.
Yeah, no, she was like obsessed with Martha Graham. I mean, I don't know where dance stands in relation to maybe visual arts for her. Music is always at the top. She loves all art and artistic expressions. But dance is definitely a theme. In A Four-Chambered Heart and another one, dance is more like of a central focus. But they're almost always intertwined. Like dance or the sonic, the visual, and movement are almost always intertwined for her. And I think that really just speaks to her her resistance to really categorizing things rigidly as being distinct, right? She has this real conceptualization of life, and everyday life is always operating through flows, the flow of things that in which we are all entangled and caught up with. And so she really liked bleeding together artistic lines, sort of in an effort to gesture to that philosophy. I didn't get into dance today, but in Seduction of the Minotaur, you're going to read it. There's a bit at the end that's really important about dance. Not the one I mentioned, but it's a similar instance that with the sonic kind of transforms her right before she kind of enters her unconscious to meet the Minotaur. Yeah, no, I think for her, because the body was so important, that's probably why she almost always pairs some sort of bodily movement theme with, in my mind, like acoustemological logics to help her characters get to know themselves, because intimacy with one's body was also important to her. But yeah, dance is definitely a theme. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was thinking of, because some of the sonic oriented descriptions you gave, in a sense, she's in a dancer kind of position, even if it's not like dance as a form.
Yeah.
This is a bodily interaction with sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I have just a sort of a tangential question. But because I'm more familiar with this than Nin at this point, have you read Four Things by Alistair Gray? Now the movie, of course.
No, I haven't read it.
Okay. Have you seen the movie?
No.
Okay. The movie is very different from the book. I recommend the book.
Okay, cool.
I think that it would be, I think you'd have a lot of things to engage with.
Yeah.
Along the same lines as what you're doing with Nin. There's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Okay, well, this was great. It looks like we're right at 6:30, so perfect timing. I just want to thank you again for joining us this evening, and thanks for coming, Helen. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too.